Something the size of a rice grain just rewrote 50 million years of Australian history, and almost nobody noticed. Deep inside a limestone cave system in the far northwest corner of Queensland, in a place so remote that most Australians will never set foot there, a team of paleontologists cracked open a slab of ancient rock and found teeth. Not dinosaur teeth, not the jaw of some towering predator, just a scattering of tiny fossilized teeth, some barely larger than a grain of rice, embedded in stone that had been sitting undisturbed for tens of millions of years. It should have been a quiet Tuesday in the field. Instead, it turned into one of the most significant mammal discoveries Australia has produced in decades, and it happened in a landscape that improbably used to be lush, dripping, tangled rainforest. To understand why a handful of ancient teeth can upend an entire scientific narrative, you have to understand what Australia's marsupials were supposed to be. For more than a century, the story taught in classrooms and museums went something like this. Marsupials rafted, walked, or otherwise made their way into Australia more than 55 million years ago, likely traveling from South America across the connected landmass of Antarctica before the continents fully separated. Once they arrived, they radiated outward into every ecological niche the continent had to offer. Kangaroos took the open plains, koalas took the eucalyptus canopy, wombats took the burrows, Tasmanian devils and quolls took up the mantle of predator. It was a single origin story, a single family tree with one root, branching outward in a tidy, comprehensible way. The new fossils, found at Riversley, a World Heritage listed fossil site tucked into the rainforest fringe landscape of northwestern Queensland, complicate that picture in a way scientists did not see coming. The teeth, along with a handful of jawbone fragments, were recovered from two specific excavation sites within the broader Riversley fossil beds, known informally among researchers by the names Dirk's Towers and Neville's Gardens. When paleontologists at the University of New South Wales examined the specimens closely, they realized the teeth did not match any known marsupial order. Not one. Every marsupial alive today, and every marsupial fossil cataloged before this, fits somewhere on the established family tree. These did not. 3 previously unknown species emerged from the analysis. 2 belong to a genus researchers have named Phantasmodon, and 1 belongs to a genus called Chiunidae that has not yet received its own species name. Together, they represent something far larger than 3 new species tucked into an existing branch. They represent an entirely new taxonomic order, a category of classification so fundamental that new ones are rarely proposed for any group of mammals, let alone Australian marsupials, whose family tree researchers believed they had mapped fairly thoroughly. The new order has been given the name Chiunomorphia, and its discovery means the marsupial family tree Australians had been taught for generations was missing an entire limb. The scientist who led the study, Timothy Churchill, did not mince words when describing what the team had found. He noted that this wasn't simply a new species slotted into a familiar branch, but a new order altogether, and possibly the oldest lineage of marsupial ever identified on the continent. He went further, suggesting the animals behind these fossils might represent the earliest ancestor of every carnivorous marsupial that came after them, a lineage stretching forward in time to produce animals as different and iconic as the modern Tasmanian devil. That claim deserves unpacking, because it is a genuinely bold one. If Chiunomorphia does sit near the root of the carnivorous marsupial lineage, it means every quoll, every devil, every small insect-hunting dunnart alive in Australia today may trace its ancestry back through this newly discovered branch, rather than through the lineage scientists had previously assumed connected them. It is the equivalent of discovering that a widely accepted family tree has an entirely unknown great-great-great-grandparent standing at its base, one who was never recorded anywhere until now, and whose existence changes how every subsequent generation should be understood. The age of these fossils only deepens the intrigue. Marsupials are believed to have first reached Australia more than 55 million years ago, arriving via a route that would sound implausible if it weren't backed by decades of geological and fossil evidence. They crossed from South America into Antarctica, and from Antarctica into Australia, at a time when all 3 landmasses were still loosely connected as fragments of the ancient supercontinent Gondwana. Antarctica back then was not the frozen wasteland it is today. It was a temperate, forested bridge between 2 continents that would later drift apart entirely, carrying their passengers with them. If the newly identified Chiunomorphia teeth are connected to an older, previously known fossil site near the town of Murgon in Queensland, as some researchers suspect they may be, then the lineage could stretch back roughly 50 million years, placing it remarkably close to the earliest window in which marsupials are known to have existed on the continent at all. That would make Chiunomorphia not just a new order, but one of the very first branches to split off after marsupials arrived in Australia, predating the diversification that eventually produced kangaroos, koalas, wombats, and the rest of the continent's unmistakable marsupial caste. And then, after tens of millions of years of quiet survival, the lineage appears to vanish. The fossil record suggests these animals persisted until roughly 15 million years ago, a period that coincides with a dramatic shift in Australia's climate. The continent, which had spent much of its early history blanketed in dense, humid rainforest, began drying out. Rainfall patterns changed. The lush forest canopy that had sheltered countless species for tens of millions of years began retreating, replaced gradually by the open eucalyptus woodland and grassland that most people associate with the Australian landscape today. For a rainforest-adapted lineage like Cunomorphia, that climatic shift appears to have been an extinction-level event. The world they were built for simply stopped existing. This is where the second discovery becomes essential to the story, because it did not emerge in isolation. Just days after the Cunomorphia announcement rippled through the paleontological community, the same broader research effort out of Riverslea produced another finding. This one focused on a different, smaller creature entirely. Researchers described a newly identified genus and species called Miyumba crisdicmani, and while it may not carry the taxonomic weight of an entirely new order, its implications are, in their own way, just as significant. Miyumba crisdicmani lived roughly 18 million years ago, squarely within the early Miocene period, in rainforests that once covered the same region of northwestern Queensland, where its fossilized remains were eventually found. The animal was tiny by any standard, weighing somewhere between 23 and 33 grams, roughly comparable in size to a modern antechinus or dunnart, the small mouse-like carnivorous marsupials that still scurry through Australian undergrowth today, hunting insects under cover of darkness. What makes Miyumba significant is not its size, but its placement on the family tree. It is now considered the oldest confirmed member of the family Dasyuridae, the group that includes today's quolls, Tasmanian devils, and antechinuses. For decades, scientists understood roughly when Dasyuridae must have emerged based on genetic estimates and broader evolutionary modeling, but they lacked hard fossil proof, pinning that emergence to a specific point in time. Miyumba changes that. It provides physical, tangible evidence that the family existed at least 18 million years ago, anchoring a timeline that had previously rested more on inference than on bone. Researchers involved in describing the species have suggested it represents a rainforest-adapted lineage of Dashurid, whose descendants may have eventually persisted not on the Australian mainland but in New Guinea, after Australia's rainforests collapsed into the drier landscape that followed. That detail matters more than it might first appear. New Guinea today hosts a surprising number of marsupial species closely related to Australian counterparts, holdovers from a time when the two landmasses were connected by lower sea levels and shared continuous habitat. As Australia dried out and its rainforests receded, some rainforest-adapted species that could no longer survive on the mainland may have found refuge in the still humid forests of New Guinea, effectively fleeing a changing climate by following the retreating rainforest itself. Miyumba's story, and the broader story of Riverslea's fossil beds, suggests this pattern of climate-driven displacement happened again and again across millions of years, quietly reshaping which animals lived where, and which lineages survived to be studied today versus which ones simply blinked out of existence when their habitat disappeared. Both discoveries were formally published within days of one another. The Cunomorphia research appeared in the Journal of Paleontology, describing the new Metatherian order in detail, and laying out the argument for its ancient, possibly foundational place in the marsupial family tree. The Miyumba crisdicmani research appeared separately in the journal Australian Zoologist, offering the first solid physical evidence that Dasyuridae existed as far back as the early Miocene. Taken together, the two papers form a remarkably coherent picture of a lost world, a Queensland once dominated by dense, closed canopy rainforest, home to an entire ecosystem of marsupial species that modern science had either misclassified, underestimated, or never known existed at all. It's worth pausing here to appreciate just how strange and wonderful Riverslea itself is as a place. Most people picture Australia the way it looks today, a continent defined by red dirt, eucalyptus forest, and vast, dry interior. Riverslea, sitting in the northwest of Queensland, doesn't look much different from that image now. But the rock formations there tell an entirely different story, one written in layers of ancient limestone that formed from sediment deposited at the bottom of long-vanished freshwater pools, surrounded by dense rainforest that would be almost unrecognizable to anyone visiting the site today. Riverslea has been producing extraordinary fossils for decades, everything from ancient crocodiles to marsupial lions to enormous flightless birds, and it remains one of the richest windows into Australia's deep evolutionary past anywhere on the planet. It has been recognized as a World Heritage Site precisely because of how much it has already taught scientists, and these two new discoveries make clear that it still has plenty left to reveal. There's a broader pattern worth noting here too, one that connects this Queensland rainforest story to other recent fossil discoveries happening in different corners of Australia. Earlier this year, researchers working at a separate site called McGrath's Flat, located beneath farmland in New South Wales, uncovered an entirely different kind of preserved rainforest ecosystem, this one dating back roughly 11 to 16 million years. Unlike the tooth and jawbone fragments recovered at Riversley, the McGrath's flat fossils were preserved in an unusually detailed way, trapped within iron-rich rock that captured not just bones but soft tissue, delicate structures like feathers, insect wings, and even individual spider hairs, frozen in place with a level of anatomical clarity that is exceptionally rare in the fossil record. Together, these separate discoveries paint an increasingly vivid picture of an Australia that spent enormous stretches of its geological history draped in rainforest, teeming with a staggering diversity of life that has almost entirely vanished from living memory, surviving now only in scattered fragments of stone. What makes all of this genuinely compelling, rather than simply academic, is the way it forces a reconsideration of assumptions that most people, including many with a casual interest in natural history, have never thought to question. Ask most people what animals lived in ancient Australia, and they'll picture something like a giant version of a modern kangaroo, or perhaps a marsupial lion, animals that fit comfortably within the framework of bigger, stranger versions of things we already know. What these new discoveries suggest is something different and, in some ways, more unsettling to the tidy narrative, that entire branches of the family tree existed, thrived for tens of millions of years, and then disappeared so completely that scientists didn't even know to look for them until a handful of rice grain-sized teeth turned up in a cave. It also raises an uncomfortable but fascinating question about how much more might still be missing. If an entirely new taxonomic order of marsupial could remain hidden in the fossil record for this long, discovered only because researchers happened to examine a particular slab of limestone closely enough to notice teeth that didn't match anything catalogued before, how many other lineages might still be sitting undiscovered in unexcavated rock, waiting for someone to crack open the right piece of stone at the right angle? Riversley alone is estimated to contain vastly more fossil material than has been excavated and studied to date. Researchers openly acknowledge that reconstructing the full, tangled roots that early marsupials took as they spread and diversified across the continent may never be fully possible. Each new fossil recovered adds another data point, another clue, but also frequently complicates the picture rather than simplifying it, revealing branches and detours that nobody anticipated. That complexity is, in its own way, the real headline here, more than any single fossil or species name. For a long time, the popular understanding of marsupial evolution in Australia leaned on a comforting simplicity. One arrival event, one ancestral lineage, one branching tree that fanned outward in a mostly predictable way to produce the animals recognized today. The Keunomorphia and Miyumba discoveries suggest that story was, at best, an oversimplification, and at worst, fundamentally incomplete. Marsupial evolution in Australia appears to have been messier, more contested, and more experimental than researchers previously assumed, with multiple lineages competing, adapting, and in many cases failing to survive the continent's dramatic climatic upheavals. Consider what that climatic upheaval actually looked like on the ground for the animals living through it. For tens of millions of years, much of Australia existed under conditions that modern visitors would barely recognize: humid, dense, dripping with rainfall, canopy closed tightly enough overhead to keep the forest floor in near-permanent shade. Species evolved specifically for that environment, adapted to hunting insects and leaf litter, navigating dense understory, surviving in a world defined by moisture and shade rather than sun and drought. Then, gradually but relentlessly, that world began disappearing. Rainfall patterns shifted as global and regional climate systems changed. The forests that had defined the continent for so long began retreating, shrinking into smaller and smaller pockets, eventually surviving only in isolated refuges like the modern-day wet tropics of northern Queensland, while the rest of the continent transformed into the drier, more open landscape recognized today. For a species built for rainforest life, that transformation wasn't a gradual inconvenience. It was existential. Animals that couldn't adapt to open woodland, that couldn't shift their hunting strategies, their body temperature regulation, their reproductive cycles to match a drier and more variable climate, simply ran out of habitat. Some lineages managed to adapt in place, evolving traits suited to the new conditions and surviving into the modern era as the ancestors of species still living today. Others, like Keunomorphia, apparently did, held on for millions of years within shrinking rainforest refuges before eventually running out of room and time entirely, vanishing from the fossil record around 15 million years ago and leaving behind nothing but a scattering of tiny teeth to mark that they had ever existed at all. It's tempting, reading a story like this, to treat it purely as ancient history, a curiosity about creatures that vanished so long ago that their disappearance carries no real weight beyond scientific interest. But there's a quieter, more resonant thread running underneath all of this that's worth sitting with. The story of Keunomorphia is, at its core, a story about what happens when a changing climate outpaces a species' ability to adapt to it. It's a story about habitat loss, about the fragility of ecosystems that seem permanent right up until they aren't, about how quickly an entire lineage that had persisted for tens of millions of years can be reduced to nothing more than a handful of fossilized teeth once the world underneath it changes. That's not a comfortable parallel to draw, but it's difficult to read the research without noticing it sitting there, unstated but present. There's also something worth appreciating about the sheer scale of scientific patience this kind of discovery requires. Riversley has been excavated by paleontologists for decades. Generations of researchers have spent careers combing through its limestone deposits, cataloging fragment after fragment, most of which never produces anything as dramatic as an entirely new taxonomic order. The teeth that eventually became Cunomorphia sat in the ground for roughly 50 million years before anyone found them, and then sat in research collections for an unknown additional stretch of time before someone with the right expertise looked closely enough to realize what they were actually looking at. Science of this kind rarely moves in dramatic leaps. It moves through accumulation, through thousands of small, careful observations, building slowly toward a moment when a pattern finally becomes undeniable. The announcement of a new marsupial order isn't the beginning of a discovery. It's the endpoint of a process that likely started with a single researcher noticing that a particular tooth simply didn't match anything in the reference collection, and refusing to let that inconsistency go unexplained. That kind of scientific stubbornness, the willingness to sit with an anomaly rather than force it into an existing category simply because that's easier, is ultimately what makes discoveries like this possible. It would have been simple enough for researchers to look at unusual teeth from Riversley and assume they represented some minor variation within an already known group, a slightly unusual population of an established species, rather than something requiring an entirely new classification. Instead, the team behind this research pushed further, comparing the specimens rigorously against everything else known from the fossil record, and concluding that no existing category fit. That conclusion, formalized and published, is what gives Cunomorphia its scientific weight. It isn't a headline invented to generate attention. It's the product of careful comparative analysis that reached its conclusion honestly, even though that conclusion complicated a picture of Australian marsupial evolution that had seemed largely settled. None of this means the story is finished either. Researchers studying Cunomorphia have been careful to note how much remains uncertain, including the exact placement of the new order relative to other known marsupial lineages, and whether the connection to the older Murgon fossil site will ultimately hold up under further scrutiny. Science operates this way by design, building conclusions that remain open to revision as new evidence comes in, rather than declaring permanent, unchangeable truths the moment a paper is published. It's entirely possible that future fossil finds at Riversley, or at other sites yet to be excavated, will refine or even significantly alter the current understanding of where Cunomorphia sits on the marsupial family tree, or how directly it connects to the carnivorous marsupials that eventually followed it. That openness to revision isn't a weakness in the research. It's exactly how good science is supposed to work, and it's part of what makes ongoing fossil hunting at sites like Riversley so genuinely valuable. Every new excavation season carries the possibility of adding another piece to a puzzle that researchers now understand is considerably larger and more complicated than they once assumed. For anyone drawn to stories about ancient Australia, this moment represents something worth paying attention to, not because a single headline captures the whole picture, but because it marks a shift in how much confidence scientists can reasonably place in the narrative they thought they understood. For years, the marsupial family tree was treated as a mostly settled question, a subject occasionally refined at the edges, but broadly stable at its core. What Riversley's newest fossils suggest instead is a lineage far more tangled, far more experimental, and far more shaped by catastrophic climate change than the tidy textbook version ever let on. Somewhere beneath the dry, sun-baked landscape of modern Queensland lies the buried record of a rainforest world that thrived for tens of millions of years, produced an extraordinary diversity of life, and then largely disappeared, leaving only scattered fragments for researchers willing to dig, sort, compare, and question, long enough to notice when something simply doesn't fit. To fully appreciate why paleontologists keep returning to Riversley year after year, it helps to understand what the site actually looked like in the deep past, long before any of these fossils were buried. During the period these animals were alive, the region sat within a broad belt of forest stretching across much of northern Australia, fed by consistent seasonal rainfall and dotted with freshwater pools and slow-moving waterways. Those pools acted, in a sense, as natural preservation chambers. As animals died near the water's edge or were carried into it by scavengers, floods, or simple accident, their remains settled into fine sediment at the bottom. Over unimaginable stretches of time, that sediment compressed and hardened into limestone, locking bones, teeth, and jaw fragments into a kind of geological time capsule, Rain, wind, and erosion eventually expose pockets of that ancient limestone at the surface, which is why modern excavators can access material that has otherwise sat undisturbed for tens of millions of years. This process explains why Riversley has become such an unusually rich source of information about ancient Australian ecosystems, rather than simply another isolated fossil find. Because the pools captured animals continuously across enormous spans of time, the resulting rock layers effectively function like chapters in a long, uninterrupted book. Different depths and different excavation zones correspond to different periods, allowing researchers to trace how species, environments, and entire ecosystems changed as millions of years passed. It is this layered structure that made it possible to identify not just isolated Cuneomorphia teeth, but a broader pattern connecting them to a specific window of time, a particular climate, and a particular kind of forest that no longer exists anywhere on the continent. It's also worth understanding a bit more about Dasyuridae itself, since Muyumba Christikmani's placement within that family carries weight that might not be obvious to anyone unfamiliar with Australian wildlife. Dasyuridae is, today, the largest family of carnivorous marsupials in Australia, encompassing dozens of living species that range enormously in size and behavior. Tasmanian devils, the largest surviving members of the family, are stocky, powerful scavengers capable of crushing bone with remarkable jaw strength. Quolls occupy a middle ground, cat-sized predators that hunt smaller animals across a range of habitats from rainforest to open woodland. At the smaller end sit dunnerts and antechinus's, delicate, fast-moving insect hunters that weigh only a few dozen grams, barely larger than a house mouse, yet display ferociously predatory behavior, scaled down to their size. Before Muyumba's discovery, researchers understood roughly when this family must have branched off from other marsupial lineages based largely on molecular clock estimates, a technique that uses the accumulated genetic differences between living species to estimate how long ago they shared a common ancestor. That approach is powerful, but it produces estimates, not proof. Muyumba changes that equation by providing an actual physical specimen that can be dated directly from the rock layer in which it was found, anchoring the family's known existence firmly at 18 million years ago, rather than leaving that figure as an inferred range. In science, the difference between an estimate and a directly dated fossil is significant. One is a calculation built on assumptions about mutation rates. The other is physical evidence you can hold, measure, and compare directly against everything else in the fossil record. There's a broader lesson embedded in that distinction, one that applies well beyond this single discovery. Genetic and molecular research has transformed how scientists understand evolutionary relationships, allowing researchers to map connections between species that might never be obvious from anatomy alone. But molecular techniques work best when paired with physical fossil evidence because fossils provide fixed points in time that genetic estimates alone cannot offer. Muyumba Christikmani represents exactly this kind of fixed point, a moment where inferred history and physical evidence finally meet, allowing researchers to say with far greater confidence not just that Dasyuridae existed by the early Miocene, but precisely what an early member of that family actually looked like, how large it was, and what kind of environment it called home. The environment itself deserves a closer look too, because 18 million years ago, the part of Queensland where Muyumba lived would have been almost unrecognizable compared to today's landscape. Instead of the dry woodland and scattered eucalyptus that now dominate much of the region, the area sat under closed canopy rainforest, humid and shaded, rich with insect life and dense understory vegetation. That kind of environment shapes the animals that live within it in specific, predictable ways. Rainforest-adapted predators tend to be smaller and more agile than their open country relatives, built for navigating tangled vegetation and hunting in low light, rather than covering long distances across open ground. Muyumba's small size fits that pattern closely, reinforcing the idea that it was a creature genuinely built for forest life, not simply a smaller version of species adapted to drier, more open habitats. That distinction matters because it helps explain what may have happened to Muyumba's lineage once Australia's climate began shifting. Species finely tuned to a specific environment often struggle far more with rapid change than generalist species that can tolerate a wider range of conditions. As rainforest retreated and open woodland spread across the continent, rainforest specialists faced a difficult choice, encoded not in conscious decision but in slow evolutionary pressure across generations. Adapt to the new conditions, migrate toward shrinking pockets of remaining rainforest, or fail to survive at all. Researchers studying Muyumba have pointed to New Guinea as a plausible refuge for descendants of this rainforest-adapted lineage, a place where humid forest conditions persisted, even as the Australian mainland dried out. It's a pattern seen in other groups of Australian plants and animals as well, lineages that effectively followed the retreating rainforest northward across what was, for long stretches of the deep past, a land bridge rather than open ocean separating the two landmasses. Considered together, Kuenomorphia and Miumba Krisdikmani tell two related but distinct chapters of the same larger story. One represents an entirely new, ancient branch of the marsupial family tree, quite possibly among the very first lineages to diversify after marsupials reached Australian shores, surviving for tens of millions of years before disappearing as the rainforest world it depended on collapsed. The other represents concrete physical proof anchoring the emergence of one of Australia's most recognizable and successful marsupial families, revealing that even this now thriving lineage began its story as a small, delicate, rainforest-bound predator rather than the more adaptable, wide-ranging animals its descendants would eventually become. Neither discovery exists in isolation from the broader scientific effort unfolding across Australia right now. Fossil sites across the country, from the layered limestone of Riversley to the iron-rich sediment preserving soft tissue at McGrath's Flat in New South Wales, are increasingly painting a coherent, if humbling, picture. Modern Australia's dry, sun-baked landscape represents only the most recent chapter of a much longer, much wetter, and far more biologically rich history. For tens of millions of years, rainforests dominated huge stretches of the continent, hosting ecosystems of astonishing diversity that have since been almost entirely erased by climatic change, leaving only scattered fragments preserved in rock for researchers patient enough to find them. That's the piece of this story worth carrying forward, beyond the individual species names and technical classifications. Every fossil pulled from Riversley's limestone represents a tiny fragment of a much larger, mostly invisible history, one that researchers are only now beginning to reconstruct with any real confidence. The teeth behind Kuenomorphia sat buried for roughly 50 million years before anyone recognized what they represented. Miumba Krisdikmani waited 18 million years to reveal precisely when one of Australia's most important predator families first emerged. Neither discovery closes the book on Australian marsupial evolution. If anything, both make clear just how much of that book remains unread, buried somewhere beneath layers of rock in a landscape that looks nothing today like the rainforest world these animals once called home. That, ultimately, is the real story behind the headline. Not a single dramatic find, but a pattern of careful, patient work, slowly revealing that Australia's evolutionary past is stranger, older, and far less settled than anyone assumed even a few years ago. The teeth that started it all are smaller than a grain of rice. What they've revealed is a chapter of Australian natural history that had been sitting hidden in plain sight for 50 million years, waiting for someone patient enough to notice.